All right, so we're going to talk about homophobia. And the two readings we've got, Richard Mohr and Patrick Hopkins, they theorize that homophobia serves a function that is related to gender. They have slightly different theories or slightly different focuses, but the core idea is very similar in both of the readings. Because there's a puzzle. Well, I'm going to start by giving Hopkins's distinction between what he calls heterosexism and what he calls homophobia, and say a few things about the word homophobia. So homophobia obviously has that phobia in it. And by analogy, something like arachnophobia is the fear of spiders. So phobias in general are sort of irrational fears. Now, neither Mohr nor Hopkins thinks that that's what's going on with homophobia, that the reaction to gay people. Essentially, homophobia is like the equivalent of racism and sexism for gays and lesbians. So nobody thinks that sexism is, men's irrational spider-like fear of women. Now, presumably there probably are some people who have some kind of phobia. I mean, Mother Nature is an amazing thing. Brains develop in weird ways. Like, there are the weirdest kind of phobias. I had a friend who had a phobia of buttons. Literally, if he had any fastenings on his clothes, he had to wear them backwards. And I asked him, "What's wrong with buttons?" And he said, "They're so buttony," so clearly irrational and weird. So probably there's some poor person who has that kind of reaction to the opposite sex. But that's not what's going on in what tends to be called homophobia. It's not a literal mental illness, although it has been used, the claim that it is a kind of mental illness has been used to exonerate people from anti-gay crimes, which in itself, the fact that that works is a sign of what we're going to call homophobia or heterosexism, because that just shouldn't fly. I mean, a similar thing has happened with racism. White people have claimed to have a genuine fear of black people and got dispensation for this, as if they were the ones to be pitied because they're disabled, not the people their prejudice is affecting the rights of. Anyway, Hopkins wants to draw a distinction between sort of grades of anti-homosexual ideology and behavior. So he distinguishes between heterosexism, which is a word that more closely parallels racism and sexism, clearly. But he says that doesn't really capture the visceral violence that is a core element of homophobia, still to this day. I mean, the university is putting on a play. I just saw some students rehearsing for this, the Laramie Project, which I believe was about the death of Matthew Shepard, who, of course, was a guy who was beaten and tied to a fence out in the middle of nowhere and killed because he was gay in Wyoming. And while that was 20 years ago, or more than that, it's still the case that gay people disproportionately experience violence. And there has been a depressing resurgence in anti-gay stereotypes and alarmism. This is part of the anti-woke movement has been to target gay people and transgender people in particular. And actually, a lot of the analysis that both of these guys give for the explanation for homophobia works, if anything, better for transphobia, because it's to do with crossing gender boundaries. All right, so the distinction that Hopkins makes is heterosexism, and again, he says, I'm just going to define these loosely, and I'm not going to say there's a hard barrier where it's clear that one thing is heterosexism and another thing is homophobia. They sort of blend into each other. And heterosexism, if anything, is milder and doesn't seem to involve the visceral, direct harm that homophobia does. But he says it's a necessary precursor. Heterosexism is a valuing and privileging heterosexuality and, of course, a correlative devaluing of homosexuality, sort of saying that heterosexuality is normal and homosexuality is therefore deviant, and people who practice it are of less value, they're somehow mistaken. And even if, strictly speaking, heterosexism would make gay people to be pitied rather than hated or feared, still, it presents them as less valuable, which of course lays the groundwork for them to be acceptable scapegoats and therefore targets of violence. So heterosexism in general, he gives the example, heterosexism is the reason why all couples on TV are heterosexual. And while it's kind of, I have lived long enough to see the tides of history at work. Not something I'm necessarily happy about, but I started my graduate career in the actually 1989, fall of 1989, but early 90s, when I would be a teaching assistant for what was called a moral problems class. And moral problems included homosexuality. It wasn't the suggestion that it was a problem, it was more that the homophobia was the problem. But still, whether or not regarding homosexuals as immoral was a defensible position was up for debate. So, is homosexuality immoral? And you would read in textbooks, would have articles that said that yes, it was immoral, and usually the argument was because it's in some sense unnatural. That was the debate back in the early 90s. And, the idea when I started in graduate school that gay marriage should be legal within a few years was just, it would have blown my mind. And yet, there it was. Gay marriage suddenly becomes legal. And we sit there thinking, wow, society can progress in a fairly short time. Not so fast. We are now very much in a backlash era where things that would have been just forbidden to say 5 or 10 years ago are now seen as perfectly comfortable things to say out loud, and if anything, the mainstream position. Certainly with the current administration that we have. So, for example, one particular pejorative that has been pushed against gay people is this term groomers, calling them groomers. Yes, there we go. And suggesting that gays are pedophiles. This is a very old slur. I mean, the readings that I've given you are from the 90s. And they're depressingly current, the things they're saying, when they should be quaint and outdated. Because the odd thing is they've come back into currency after a period where it looks like, oh, this is just the way it was in the past. But this old suggestion that gay people are pedophiles, gay men specifically, has been revived with a vengeance with this slur groomer. And that was in the last election cycle where that was pushed. And of course, trans people who were an ignored minority at the time in the early 90s they're still a tiny minority, but somehow they have been identified as perhaps the most obvious legitimate target of conservatives. And one of the most, I just saw something that said that the most successful political advertisement of the last election was the Trump commercial that said, Kamala is for they, them, Trump is for you. And obviously, when he was saying you, he was specifically talking to billionaires, but we didn't know that. But this idea that the bad side is the one that is prepared to be accepting of gender nonconformity was very successful. So this is an example of anti-LGBTQ propaganda being politically successful, engaging in targeting this particular group, being a successful political strategy, a way to succeed in politics. Okay, but Hopkins and Mohr, in a slightly different way, are both insisting that homophobia, despite its title, is not a psychological condition. It is not a psychological condition. Both heterosexism and homophobia are ideological, political positions. The people who are most committed to them, who are most anti-gay, might not recognize that that is the case, but this then parallels nicely with the idea of systemic racism, that it is entrenched and it's built into society and it serves a function, and because it serves this function, it keeps getting maintained and renewed. And the only way to get rid of homophobia is not training, not going off to be taught to be more tolerant and to examine one's own prejudices. That just won't do it. That's like, personal recycling is not going to save the planet. Personal recycling, by the way, is a trick by the plastics industry that enables them to keep producing vast quantities of plastics. They know that personal recycling will do nothing, and in fact most plastic doesn't get recycled, but it enables people to feel good as if they're saving the planet, and enables the plastic industry to continue. A very similar thing, an analogous phenomenon is, if you sensitivity training for people who have gay bashed, even if it works on some particular individuals, like for example, Tim Hardaway Sr. said a lot of very anti-gay things and went through sensitivity training and appears now to have changed his ways. Now, of course, we don't know how sincere he is, and this just could be so that he gets into the Hall of Fame or something like that. But even if it did work, that's just one individual. So the cut to the end, spoiler, the solution that Hopkins suggests, the only way we're going to get rid of this is to dismantle the whole system of gender roles, which of course is very unlikely to happen because there's a significant chunk of society that views them as natural and important, and of course there's religious views attached to that. All right. So yeah, let's talk about Mohr's analysis of stereotypes. So part of heterosexism and homophobia is embedded in the popular presentation of gays and lesbians. And right from, all throughout the 20th century, a very big one was mistaken gender identity. That is, gay people, actually this works for both gay men and lesbians. Gay men are presented as effeminate. I mean, comedians in the 70s in England, you know, if you were being gay, you would move like this, you would have a limp wrist for some reason, and probably a lisp. There's a strangely famous British 70s sitcom got entrenched in PBS broadcasts over here and has way lived past its natural life. It should have died a death in the 70s. It's a show called Are You Being Served? And that show had a character played by an actor called John Inman who was clearly gay. And he worked in a department store. I mean, in some sense, it was slightly progressive because he was a positive character. You know, people regarded him as an equal. They weren't attacking him. So in that sense, you can kind of see it as a progressive show. But he was a screaming example of everything about this stereotype. You know, he moved like this. He was, you know, this kind of thing. Now, of course, that stereotype presents gay men in particular as ridiculous, humorous, the butt of jokes. That's one stereotype. And of course, humor can be used and is used to put people in line, particularly in schools. How do coaches get their boys to, play football or whatever the way they want them to? They call them girls if they don't put in the effort. Okay, girls. And of course, the one step beyond calling them girls that was perfectly acceptable 30 years ago and slightly less acceptable since is to call them fags, to call them queers, because that's like the extreme version of calling them girls. So it's a way to make them feel ashamed because they're objects of derision, and therefore force them into the correct way of behaving, which is the male gender role, with all of the features that are supposed to be built into it, that Hopkins lists, like aggression, like low affect. You know, you're not supposed to have access to your emotions. He lists a bunch of the features that the masculine gender role in the United States in particular includes. It's interesting that in even very patriarchal societies elsewhere in the world, some of these things are just not there. Like, for example, in the Arab world, which is very sexist overall, certainly women's rights are far less politically protected in general than they are in the West and in the United States. But there are certain things that are perfectly acceptable in the Arab world, like men walking along holding hands. Nobody bats an eye. Yet that would be a huge violation of US masculinity. Heterosexual prowess, sexual conquest of women, these are things that to be masculine, you have to exhibit these behaviors. Heading a nuclear family, and notice that not all of these are consistent. So that can strain people's attempt to achieve masculinity. It's almost a paradoxically unachievable ideal, because if you head a nuclear family, you're not supposed to be screwing around. But of course, if you're a real man's man, you have to do both. Like, I don't know, Don Draper in Mad Men. You're supposed to sire children. If you don't have children, you're not truly a man. You're supposed to have compete with other men. You can't sort of be happy about the success of other men. That presents you as kind of a loser and a weakling. You've got to be independent. You've got to be have strict emotional control and at the same time be aggressive. So you've got to control your emotions, but be aggressive. It's as if the only emotion that men are allowed to exhibit is anger, and so on. Certain ways of walking, obviously not walking like this, but straight. I mean, that's another thing. There's a real contrast between some European presentations of masculinity and American presentations. So, for example, sitting with your legs crossed. There's absolutely nothing wrong with a man doing that in Europe and England. But here, men can't sit with their legs crossed. They got to sit with their legs wide open, ideally scratching their crotch as they do so. That's the true masculine presentation. All right, so gays are supposed to be not that. Gay men violate those masculine gender norms and are therefore humorous, ridiculous, silly. So gays are silly. But on the other hand, as Mohr says, paradoxically, the other predominant stereotype of gay people is that they are sinister, that there's a homosexual agenda. It's as if they're, like a supervillain organization, that they've got a lair built into a volcano on an island somewhere where they cook up plans for world domination. They're out to recruit, and they are sex crazed. This comes up an awful lot in Christian conservative criticisms of gay men, that all they want to do is just shag everywhere. But also they're pedophiles, and calling anybody a pedophile, or paedophile, as we say in England, is the biggest blank check to assault them that you can imagine. Because you're saying you're victimizing the most innocent and weakest people that we have to protect. So if anything, we would be remiss if we did not savagely attack you. We would be not doing our duty to protect the children of the society. So what kind of people would we be if we did not attack gay people because they're groomers? They're trying to recruit, they're trying to molest children. So anytime you see pedophile used, and it's used on individuals quite often. I mean, it's Elon Musk's default response to anyone who disagrees with him, for example. Like, people have forgotten, I think, when those Thai school kids got stuck in the caves that flooded. Elon Musk had a submarine that he was working on, and he suggested that he was going to use his submarine to save them. And there were cave divers who knew that this was ridiculous because it was a very narrow, and just said, no, that's stupid, that won't work. And he responded by calling them pedophiles. These were the people that actually did save the kids, so they're heroes, but his retort was that they were pedophiles. Why? Because that's the worst thing you can call anybody. So the fact that that's built into a stereotype of gay people kind of presents gay people as a legitimate target for abuse and assault. So, now where do these stereotypes come from? That's what Mohr is interested in discussing. It would be, because most people say, well, there's a core of truth in any stereotype. So is it the justifiable explanation of a stereotype is that they come from generalizations. This is what people say about the slur directed at young black men, that they're thugs. They can say, but look, I'm just generalizing. I can point to crime statistics. But of course, crime statistics just show that they're arrested at a greater rate. That doesn't show that they're committing crimes at a greater rate. In fact, that might be an indication of racism. But at least it's a move that people make. They try to justify this in terms of this is a legitimate generalization. People of this kind legitimately are more like this than people not of this kind. And that's just from research. Is that where these come from? And obviously not. If anything, the real people who are guilty of pedophilia are heterosexual fathers. It's the people most often molesting children are their own parents. And if you actually do studies, Mohr says homosexuals are lower than heterosexuals at pedophilia. So, and a famous example of debunking the idea that science has shown gay people to be a certain kind of way is because it used to be the case that homosexuality was classified as a mental illness. Until 1973, it was in the DSM, the Diagnostical and Statistic Manual, that homosexuality is a mental illness. People like Lou Reed of the Velvet Underground showed gay tendencies when he was a teenager and was given electric shock therapy to cure him of this mental illness. Now, the basis for this was psychologists who claimed to be experts on this particular mental illness said that, oh, you can do personality tests of people where you don't ask them anything about their sexual behavior, and we, the experts, can tell the difference between the answers a straight person would give and the answers a gay person would give, because the homosexuality affects all other areas of their personality, and we can tell the signs. And this psychologist, Evelyn Hooker, who had gay friends and was working with gay liberation movements, did a study of this, presented these so-called experts with just exactly these questionnaires and asked them to sort them into gay and straight piles. And they did worse than random chance, proving that they were, to use a technical term, full of shit. So since that time, Evelyn Hooker was very instrumental in getting homosexuality removed as a mental illness. But it's a good illustration that clearly these generalizations do not come from, these stereotypes do not come from generalizations. So if they don't come from actually looking at gay people and saying, hey, this is what they're like, where do they come from? And his suggestion is very similar to Hopkins' suggestion, that they serve a function. They serve an ideological function, which is why they are immune to counter-evidence. Because you can show people counter-evidence. No, it's not the case that gays violate gender norms. Gays in the sense of people who have same-sex attraction, if we define them like that, those people are not any more likely to meet either of these criteria than heterosexuals, and if anything, less likely. You can show people all the evidence you like, and that's not going to undercut these stereotypes, because these stereotypes are not meant to be real. They're just meant to be usable to serve a function, a societal function. Now, what is that societal function? The answer is, what are the functional roles? Well, according to Mohr, they serve slightly different functional roles. So, for example, the mistaken gender identity one is to reinforce gender roles. We've already seen that where accusations of being gay are supposed to make you act more manly if you're a boy, or act more, if you're called a dyke when you're a girl, that means your hair's too short, you're wearing jeans, you're not wearing makeup, you got to start doing those things. So now, the obvious next question is, why is that so important? Why is that so important? And that question is harder to answer. But notice what the conservative response would be is that that's natural, that gender roles are natural. Naturally, humans divide into females who are feminine and males who are masculine. But if that was the case, then you wouldn't need to reinforce gender roles. So what we're supposed to believe is that boys will be boys. Human beings who are born with a penis and testicles are biologically male and will be biologically masculine. So it's a biological essentialist view about sex and gender. Sex being male-female, gender being masculine or feminine. That one follows from the other, like the argument that testosterone makes you more aggressive and so on. If that's true, though, there's no point to these stereotypes, because you don't need, if a boy is a boy, you don't need to tell him to act like a boy. He just will. In fact, there's no point to telling him how to behave, because he has a biological imperative to behave a certain way. Boys will be boys. You know, oh well, you can't tell them anything. But at the same time, there seems to be this parallel contradictory idea that if we let the gays get hold of our children, they will program them to be gays. How does this work? I mean, it's like, I don't ever remember making a choice about my sexual preferences. That seems to be something that's a discovery. And yet it seems to be argued that it wasn't, that it's just because I wasn't exposed to corrupting influences that I became straight rather than gay. In fact, the way that Hopkins in particular stresses is what really seems to be the belief is that manhood is a tenuous, he focuses on manhood, because notice that it is the targets of violence. While lesbians are certainly targeted for violence a fair amount, it's nothing like the proportion that gay men are. And notice that if we apply the analysis to transgenderism, the ones, well, both of them are subject to violence, but it's for slightly different reasons. But the ones that, for example, someone like J.K. Rowling seems obsessed with are male to female, that is, trans women. They're the ones that are the real subject of outrage, you know, because then you'll have a man going into women's bathrooms or things like this. Clearly a very committed pedophile. How can I get into women's bathrooms? I know, I'll have extensive surgery. That'll do it. That'll trick them. Anyway. So in fact, it reversed. What we're supposed to believe, the standard conservative view, is that sex roles and gender roles are just natural and biological. But the way they are moved to act against gays is motivated by the idea that, in fact, being a man is a very tenuous status that must be perpetually maintained by playing the role. And if you cease to play the role, your manhood card might get revoked. Like that ad for the AR-15. What was that? Whatever the opposite of revoke, manhood card revoked. It was, it showed a picture of an AR-15, you know, the school shooting gun, as it is known, and said, you know, manhood card like reacquired or something like that. I can't remember the exact slogan. So having a big ass gun that you can kill people with, phew, I'm back in the man slot again. I have performed the right role, and I'm safe from being gay bashed for a while. But you got to keep doing it. You can't let it slip, which is the opposite of the idea that it's just a natural category that you have no choice over. So what the role of this stereotype in particular is to ferry people back into the masculine slot. Again, that still leaves the question, why is it so important to society that we have these rigid gender roles maintained, when clearly they're actually not natural, that people, if left alone, this was one of the lessons drawn from the Kinsey report, that in their private lives, people are much more willing to try sexual activity across the spectrum. Many more so-called heterosexual men have experienced sex to orgasm with another man than had been thought in mid-century United States. So clearly, when left alone, when out of the public eye, people are not neatly in boxes. They will have sex with a much wider variety of partners. Now, one thing that Mohr in particular says is that sex is seen as a dangerous force, and an important role of, in particular, the view of gays as sex crazed is to encourage other people not to be sex crazed. Although, I don't know, it's built into the idea of a real man that he's hot to trot at every opportunity. So I don't know how far that goes. But certainly sex is seen as something dangerous, is presented as a dangerous force. I was just having a conversation when I first came to America. I saw, to my amazement, that they had all the Nightmare on Elm Street movies playing on Saturday morning TV. So you could see people getting gutted with knives and, fountains of blood, but you couldn't see a naked body. That was all edited out, and you couldn't hear the word hell or damn. So sex is seen as much more dangerous than extreme violence in American culture. So us versus... so humor is used to herd people into the correct gender roles. But if that doesn't work, then the sinister threat divides us into us versus them, that gays are perverted and dangerous and sinister and immoral, and therefore, because they're immoral, they are appropriate targets of attack. I mean, it's a little unfair to attack people if they can't help being just, silly, if they are by their nature kind of limp-wristed. It's a little bit unfair to target them. But if they're immoral, if they're dangerous, if they're sinister and predatory, open season. It's your duty to attack them. It's your duty to destroy their culture, to remove all of these gay books from public libraries because they're part of the spreading rot. And that's what we're seeing at the moment. And of course, the other use to which gay people and trans people are being used is as a way to target a particular part of the political spectrum. Anybody who is tolerant of LGBTQ people, who doesn't regard them as a threat, clearly is, collaborators. The collaborators who don't care enough about the safety of our children, and they are therefore immoral and should be rejected, as in the Kamala is for they, them strategy. Okay, tie it in with Hopkins. Hopkins has a theory that another suggestion for why we care so much about gender roles. Why are there people who act as hallway monitors for gender? Like, for example, I just read this a couple of days ago. There's a proposed Arkansas law. Having lived in Arkansas, this does not entirely surprise me. Against gender non-conforming haircuts, so that if a hairdresser accedes to a request to give a girl a boy's haircut or a boy a girl's haircut, that hairdresser can suffer penalties. Think about that. First of all, what counts as gender non-conforming? I grew up in the 70s when every boy had long hair. What was a gender non-conforming haircut then? I don't know. And of course, nowadays, all boys have this poodle haircut where it's short and they actually get a perm on top. That, in my time, that would be regarded as kind of girly. Is that gender non-conforming? I don't know. Who gets to judge? But the very idea that you would propose a law against this seems like a throwback to at least the 50s. But it's a classic example of, being a hallway monitor about gender. So who is driven to do this? Who is driven? Like another analogy is, probably some of you were too young to go through the gay marriage, where a popular Get Out the Vote ad this cycle was this anti-trans suggestion. And so if you want to get your base and your right-wing conservative, if you want to get your base out, you gin them up, you get them excited by putting anti-trans like bathroom bills on the ballot. That way they will be motivated to come out and vote for your candidate while they're voting for anti-trans. So it's sort of red meat for the base. So this time around it was all anti-trans stuff. In the George W. Bush era, it was anti-gay marriage stuff. So there would be state prohibitions on gay marriage, which got overturned with the Supreme Court case that allowed gay marriage, and which will immediately kick back in when that Supreme Court case gets overturned, like Roe versus Wade was overturned. So get ready for a reliving of the George W. Bush era. Anyway, this is I imagine, I hope, this is mystifying to young people today. Why would anyone be opposed to why would any heterosexuals be opposed to allowing gay marriage? As the joke went, if you don't like gay marriage, don't get gay married, In other words, what's it to you? That's the mystery. That's the puzzle of homophobia. Why are straight people so obsessed to the point of violence, to the point of political marginalization with gay people? Explain this. And this is the attempt to explain it. It's because, and it was presented, gay marriage was seen as a threat. People actually came out and say, if gays can get married, then my marriage is worth less. As if, it's a holy institution, and if we allow this rabble in, there goes the marriage neighborhood. Hopkins' attempt to explain this is that your sense of self, your personhood, your sense of who you are is intrinsically gendered. As he says, nobody thinks of themselves as just a human being. They think of themselves as a man or a woman. Essentially, that is your essence, to the extent that most non-trans people cannot imagine being the other thing. just can't imagine. That wouldn't be me. That would be something else. If I just couldn't be that. So your personhood is intrinsically gendered, and it is relational. That is, to be one category is to be not the other. So what this is defined in contrast to the other, which is why so many divisions in this country are binary, and why conservatives about sex are so reluctant to admit the existence of intersexuals. Because if you admit that sex is not a binary, then that muddles the whole picture. Being a man is not enough to be not a woman to be a man. If there are more options, it's far too complicated. But yes, binaries crop up everywhere. Mohr lists a bunch of them, like breadwinner, supported person. Where's his list? But yeah, he points, yeah, here we go. Breadwinner and homemaker, protector, protected, boss, secretary, doctor, nurse, priest, nun, hero, whore, saint, and siren. These are sort of complements that if you're not one, you are the other, and you want to be the good one. You want to be the one that is valorized. So being a man requires being not a woman, and that's why being accused of being a woman is a way to, or a gender traitor like a homosexual is a way to herd people back into their right slot. So gender treachery is somebody who is prepared to non-conform. There are interesting examples of this. There's a basketball player. What's the kid's name? He went to Duke. He's a rookie for the Philadelphia 76ers, who was doing great, and then he blew out his knee. But he paints his nails. Why? Just because he wants to, because he's kind of an interesting kid. He also has a large social media following. And does little dances on TikTok and stuff like that. So here's an example of somebody who's very comfortable in his own self, and is so comfortable that he doesn't care if people think he's a little bit swishy. This is a sign, you would think, of somebody who is mentally healthy, that they don't care about other people's opinions of themselves. People like that, though, are the most dangerous gender traitors of them all, because they present living outside the boxes as appealing. So this is why drag queen story hour is the biggest thing that drives Christian conservatives crazy. This is something that has been offered at some local libraries, where a drag queen comes in and reads a story to kids and then fields kids' questions. You know, why are you wearing women's clothing? Well, I feel more comfortable, this kind of thing. It's kind of adorable if you look at the videos, because the kids have no inhibitions at asking questions that, you know, some adults want to ask but think it would be rude. And, you know, they've got nothing invested in it yet, because they haven't been fully enmeshed in the gender ideology. Although it catches on really quickly. I remember my older kid, when he was in kindergarten, he wanted to get shoes, and they were selling them in Land's End. And they came in all kinds of colors. You know, they were little tennis shoes. And he picked the pink ones. And we thought, uh-oh, this is going. He already has long hair, and this is going to get him in trouble. But he wanted the pink ones, so we got him the pink ones. And the first day he wore them, he came home and he said, some kid said, "Are those your sister's shoes?" And we thought, oh, it's started. But we were so pleased at the next sentence. He says, "But the joke's on him, because I don't have a sister." And we thought that was great. But sadly, pretty soon, he stopped wearing the pink shoes. Why? Because he was not in a secure enough position to be a gender traitor. This basketball player is a brilliant basketball player. So he's kind of got a safe, he is already in a position of where he is lauded and valued and envied. Whereas our kid, sorry, didn't have that. Not an athlete by any means. So was not in a position to be safe from these gender slurs. And it happens pretty quickly because parents are so invested in programming their kids. I mean, like teachers, this drives me crazy. Teachers in kindergarten and elementary are always dividing the class into girls versus boys and having competitions. Why are you doing that? Why aren't you getting, why divide it along those lines? And then like scorning the boys if they lose. And then wondering why later the boys grow up to be incels and hate women. It's a mystery to me. Okay, so you get the basic idea that the reason for the seemingly extreme reaction to gay people, given what conservatives themselves say, that sex is natural and gender is naturally follows from biological sex, then you can't, how would you even explain gay people? Or they would just be, an interesting minority, but they would be no threat to masculinity or manhood. They certainly couldn't convert anybody if this was true. Why then is there this huge obsession with gay people as groomers, which has no basis in fact? Nobody can cite any studies that would support this. People do trot out examples. And here's another point that Mohr points out. He says, you never hear about heterosexual murderers, but you do hear about gay murderers. Everybody knows John Wayne Gacy was gay. Jeffrey Dahmer, gay. I think the cannibal part is a little bit more important. But so if a gay person does anything bad, then their gayness is cited as relevant to the badness. Whereas if heterosexuals do it, it isn't. Where is the Christian conservative outrage at Catholic priests or any priests, actually? It's just the Catholic Church had its scandal before the Mormon Church, before the Baptist Church. They're all rampant pedophiles. And, same, what about Boy Scout troops? Obviously, if you are a pedophile, that's where you're going to go. Why aren't those targeted? Because there is legitimate evidence that those people are pedophiles at a much greater incidence. Why is it that gay people are targeted when you've got no evidence that they have this? Answer, because it's not about evidence. Pedophile is a useful tool to put them in their place. Yes, so if you're a friend with gay people, like there's very sad incidences of kids who've grown up best friends and then one of them realizes that they're gay and the friendship ends. Why? Because the other one cannot afford to associate with a pariah. Because it might taint them, it might undermine their identity. So it destroys friendships when they hit puberty and they realize what their orientation is. So association with gays attacks your own identity, and I tied this in with the gay marriage attacks your identity. Your marriage is an important indication of your heterosexuality, but not if gay people can get married. Whereas slurs and queer bashing reinforces your personality. If you're attacking gay people, then surely you can't be labeled as one. It makes you safe again, particularly if you're questionable yourself. Which is why one of the popular gay explanations for homophobia is that the people doing it are themselves repressed homosexuals. Now, it does often happen that, there's an example of this in the movie American Beauty, which has kind of declined in reputation, probably because of its star. But, there's a character in there who is a repressed homosexual who ends up murdering somebody because of their self-disgust. Is that the explanation of all homophobia? No, it's just a minority. The majority of people who are homophobic are not themselves gay. Is it because they're ignorant or they genuinely have a phobia? No, that's too irrational an explanation, because if you look at the way that homophobia operates in society, it serves this sustaining role that preserves gender as a structure, as a system of binaries that forces people into their correct slots, which maintains a system where men are privileged over women. So heterosexism and sexism are like that. Political convenience, which is why it's always disappointing to see the famous heterosexist like Anita Bryant, was it, back in the 80s, being women. And there's an awful, like that horrible libs of TikTok woman, definitely a homophobe, or helping to spread homophobic slurs, a woman. It is kind of interesting that these people are so concerned with heterosexism, when if these writers are correct, heterosexism is closely tied with the maintenance of rigid gender categories that work against women because they're in the inferior, less regarded, less well paid slot. Political convenience, that does explain some, like the Kamala is for they, them. Political people who are concerned to rise in far-right politics, hey, you got to have a scapegoat, and it's either immigrants or LGBTQ. So pick, and if you can find a gay immigrant, wow, a gay immigrant that committed a murder, you've hit the jackpot. What's the solution? Dismantle gender, says Hopkins. Well, that's unlikely to happen, unfortunately. A couple of things that Mohr says that I want to make sure that I mention. He points out that being gay is an invisible minority. So this explains why gays' suffering can be underplayed in society, why there can be a lot more of them than you think. So if you, there's a famous case where a Supreme Court justice voted one way on a case that worked against gay people's rights, and then discovered that their trusted clerk of many years was gay, and kind of regretted their vote, and sort of said, well, why didn't you say so? And of course, there's cases of right-wing politicians like Dick Cheney who have gay children, and that making them, depart from the majority of their party in supporting gay rights. So if you know someone, if someone near and dear to you, or someone that you like or respect is gay, you're much less likely to be virulently anti-gay. But the gay people being an invisible minority I mean, obviously, colored people, people of color, cannot be an invisible minority. Their race is visible for all to see, except for the ones that can pass. Whereas with gays, if you keep your behavior under wraps, people won't know you're gay. And this helps to keep individual gay people safe, but it also means that it works against gay people as a group, because it means that they're less likely to come out and advocate, and they're less likely to be role models, and so on. They're like sexual assault survivors, people who want to keep their status hidden because they don't want the bad societal views of them to be applied to them, and they don't want their they want their privacy, which means that now, of course, this is not true of trans people. So that's an important distinction between trans and gay people. So the closet is a very important feature of gay life. That is, you're in the closet until you feel you're in a safe enough space, particularly if you're in a very conservative area, particularly maybe if you're in Arkansas, you're much more likely to stay in the closet longer, which is why repressive societies literally boast that they don't have gay people. They say, we don't have gay people in our society. You know, gay people aren't here. That's something that they have in San Francisco. Yes, all of the gay people from Arkansas leave Arkansas as soon as they can and go to somewhere much more accepting, like San Francisco. But it also means that crimes are underreported, because if you're assaulted because you are coming out of a gay bar, you're much less likely to press charges. So it's sort of, it's a vicious cycle. Violence against gay people is approved because they're immoral, because they're supposed to be immoral, and also it's punished less. Even if you press charges, judges will say things that's quoted at length in the Mohr article, like, oh, it's just boys, being rambunctious, and of course there's the famous case where the guy who shot Harvey Milk and another politician. Harvey Milk was one of the most famous early out gay politicians in San Francisco, and the defense said that he'd eaten too many Twinkies, and Twinkies were supposed to have all of these additives, which they do, and was sort of temporarily insane as a result, and that worked. And it wouldn't have worked if the victim had not been a gay person. At least that's the argument. So self-blame helps keep gays repressed. They internalize these negative stereotypes. They say, oh my God, I find myself turning into this. When you feel your first attraction to someone of the same sex, it's like, oh God, it's not something you welcome, because you know your life is going to be hard, and people are going to hate you, and you might even, particularly if you've been raised in a very religious household, believe that this is deeply immoral. Queer bashing is like lynching, is another thing that Mohr says, like the murder of Matthew Shepard. It wasn't just a murder, it was a murder to send a message that his body, they didn't dispose of his body, like, oh God, we've accidentally killed him, we better cover this up. The body is left there, and in general, people, gay people who are violently attacked, it's meant to send a message. Just like lynching of black people was meant to send a message to keep black people in line, to keep them afraid, and to stop them exercising their rights. So that's part of homophobia as well. All right, there you go. Interesting theories. The connection between homophobia and heterosexism and gender roles and sexism.